and we are here live in this episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. I'm so very excited for this conversation today. I have my guest. I'm going to introduce my guest right now. And as you may have seen from either LinkedIn post, so I will introduce Miss Sarah Baldeo. She is an AI neuroscientist, best-selling author, TED speaker, and innovation advisor. And for nearly 2 decades, she has worked in the intersection of neuroscience and artificial intelligence, helping Fortune 100 companies, governments, and universities prepare for the future of the human mind. She's also the best-selling author of this book, 100 Ways to Future-Proof Your Brain in the Age of AI. And it has been a national bestseller. And I should say that I met Sarah at listening to her speak at the American Psychological Association convention, and I was just impressed by the content of the talk at that time, when everybody was discussing the specifics about how to use AI, and then coming into a discussion of how to use AI, how does AI impact our brain. So a lot of great conversation today. Welcome, Sarah, to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Yari. I'm always happy when, like I said, we get to meet in person first. So it was so cool to meet in Denver and connect before connecting virtually.
Yes, and I was very impressed by your story as I've got to know more about your work. So I want to first understand in terms of why did you choose this particular path of studying the neuroscience and also AI.
Mm-hmm. So it's a definitely a good story. I don't know if it's good enough of a story to be a movie, but
Absolutely.
my parents are both immigrants. One from South America, one from the Caribbean, and so they immigrated to Canada long before I was born. And like many immigrant parents, they said, I always say this. They're like, well, my daughter is going to be a doctor or a lawyer. That's the acceptable level of proving your value and kind of success. And I think that this is for a lot of people, a relatable experience. So I started on the path to become a neurosurgeon. So I was actually pre-med. I wrote my MCATs. I finished my first thesis, and then I was going down the path to become a surgeon. And so when I went into the lab and I was getting ready to kind of embark on my graduate studies and taking it to the next level, I had this kind of epiphany of I really don't want to be in a lab dissecting animals and, the brain for ostensibly a decade or longer. And I really felt this moment of, I want to be a practitioner. I want to be building technology for the way the human brain works. And I want to concurrently continue to do the research in neuroscience labs. But it really was that intersection of how do we build artificial intelligence for the way the human brain processes information? And how do we, and that's kind of the title of the book. How do we upgrade the brain? How do we future-proof the brain? How do we push it to evolve to the next level from a physiological perspective? And so that was my inspiration, came partly from, I would say, family pressure, and partly from the fact that my late grandfather was a very successful psychologist in Pennsylvania. And he kind of fed this love for neuroscience and psychology and understanding, what is happening with the cognitive science of the human brain. So a good inception story.
That's wonderful, and the focusing on the applicability of AI and the impact. And right now, of course, this topic is very, very relevant, especially with all the misconceptions there. And one of the things that impressed me in terms of your work is how the realization of having an actual expert who knows about not AI, you as a technologist, a coder, but also about how the impacts of our brain and how it works. I want to understand, what are some of the myths that you see out there right now in terms of use of AI and the impact to us as individuals?
Mm-hmm. Yadi, I think, and we touched on this at the APA convention, that was essentially this whole kind of demystifying this doom bubble. It's this bubble of doom and gloom and fear-mongering. And one of the kind of central themes that I speak about in my travels and keynotes and kind of wherever it is in the world that I have the privilege to speak, it's this deification of technology, right? These mystical qualities that we don't understand. And if we use AI, it's going to take over our brains, it's going to take over our lives. I was watching a podcast recently, and this gentleman said AI is a narcissist, is a psychopath, and it is manipulative.
Hmm.
And when I heard that, I thought, that is not reality. That is not reality. And so one of the biggest myths is that AI is destroying the brain, that it's destroying our cognitive function, that it's destroying us as a society. And I do feel it's imperative for us to look back on history and to really evaluate how many times have we heard that narrative. It's not the first time. We've heard this narrative with the introduction of the phone, the introduction of the automobile, the introduction of electricity. Definitely, it's this fear of the new and the unfamiliar and that which cannot be explained. Here's the difference with artificial intelligence. Historically, we would see these inflection points every time there was an industrial revolution. The scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial kind of mechanical revolution. We see this inflection point of how people process information. Here's the difference with AI. We do not have decades to process the change. AI isn't new. And of course, I speak about this very freely. It's been around since the 1950s. People don't know that. But even these generative AI tools have been around since the 1960s, the mid 1960s. None of it is new. The media coverage is new, and the accessibility of the public is new.
Yeah.
And I think the tertiary point is how quickly it's evolving. That pace of technological evolution is the first time we're seeing this. And so, I promised you I would have my little brain model here.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
this kind of external cortex of the brain, this is your frontal cortex. It was designed to be neuroplastic. It was designed to be flexible and adaptable. But the challenge that people are having is the human capacity to learn that quickly and upskill that quickly has not yet been developed. Here's the caveat. It can be developed. We can evolve. We can access the parts of our brains that help us to override that, that fear, that fight or flight response, that survival response to what we don't recognize or understand. It is possible to do that, but that requires us to upgrade the brain. And so these myths about AI and all this fear, I encourage people, think about all the times that technology was feared over the years. It's not the first time, it won't be the last.
So that's very important, that what you mentioned there about the need to upgrade our brains in order to catch up with the rate of the changes. So it's not that we're passive victims, that we don't need to be passive, quote unquote, victims of what's happening in the technology. Because when I hear, for example, there was a concept that I'm being seen a lot in the news about mind slap, or how AI is making us lazy. What advice do you have when it comes to the effective use of AI that we should adopt in order to start upgrading our brains?
So I love the term you use. There's another term called intellectual leveling. And intellectual leveling, and I'm sure anybody who is on LinkedIn, who's on their LinkedIn feed, people start to use the same language, right? They start to use the same words. You read your emails, and there's this joke of, you have two large language models and they're talking to each other. And behind them are two people, but the two people are not speaking to each other. And so this concept of let's call it cognitive laziness, I encourage people to think about the fact that the brain is lazy. Your brain is actually the laziest muscle. And why is that? Because it's always striving to be efficient. It's striving to use the least amount of resources and to preserve your neurological resources so that you can function for longer, so that you can do more. And so when we think about using artificial intelligence, I really encourage people, do not outsource your critical thinking. Really great example. Sarah, I want to use AI to respond to my emails. I'm just going to copy the email. I'm going to paste the email into Claude or Perplexity or ChatGPT, and I'm just going to get it to respond to me. Here's my first question. I asked them, have you trained your version of AI that you're using? And immediately they say, what do you mean? I didn't know I had to do that. I didn't know that I had to. Of course, you have to train it. You have to train the tools you're using. These are models. Think of them as algorithms. Think of them as these things that need to be shaped. It needs to be shaped on your tone, your cadence, your knowledge, your subject matter expertise. And I think I gave you this really great example. Somebody asked me this at an accounting conference. And they said, I want to use ChatGPT to respond to my emails. I said, so here's what you do. Take your email history in whatever you use, Outlook, Google Suite, doesn't matter. Take your email history, print it, and save it as a PDF. Take that PDF, upload that file into the generative AI tool you're using, and give it a prompt and say, I want to create a project folder for my email responses. Here is how I speak. Here is how I articulate my thoughts. Here is how I elucidate what I'm trying to say. I want you to respond as I would. Nice. That's just one example of training your AI tools instead of the reverse, which is saying, I'm just going to outsource problem solving, critical thinking, research. I'm not even going to read the research papers. I get this one a lot. I shared with you, I have a sophomore. My son is a sophomore. Mm-hmm. And so he'll say, I have to do research and I'm just going to type in the question. And I say to him, when you would go into a library back in the day, back in my day, you would open a dozen books. And you would go down many, many different rabbit holes, right? You had a hypothesis. You had a conclusion. You had some inkling of the conclusion you wanted to get to, but you would formulate all these beautiful neural pathways that gave you the ability to fact check. I always ask people, when you ask, generative AI a question, are you fact checking? Are you going back and asking for the citation and the sources? Are you reading the study yourself so that you understand the context? There's a reason that we have research studies. And there's one particular example of this. I don't know if you saw it recently. MIT had this study where they said 95% of Gen AI projects fail. Oh, wow. That's a really bold claim. Now, as a researcher yourself, and I encourage people who aren't researchers to think about this. If you go and you read that study and you try to find out how many people were part of that study, 52. Oh, wow. Okay. So that's not and the context. Yeah. Right. But when you're scrolling through your feed and you're seeing, oh my gosh, 95% of Gen AI projects fail. Your first question is, why are they failing? The fact-checking question that you should be asking when you see these headlines, when you see these responses come back to you is, I need to look at the source. I need to understand where did that conclusion come from? This is an example of critical thinking and of the dialogue that you're supposed to be having with generative AI. And I keep saying generative AI versus ChatGPT because ChatGPT is not the only tool. And generative AI is not the only kind of AI. And I think people just put everything into this bucket, right? Everything is ChatGPT. That's not the case. It's one kind of an AI tool.
Yeah, that's fascinating because it is kind of us living through headlines. I say, as you were mentioning that factor of the research study, and we think we're being efficient or clever by asking for research background on specific topics and just focusing on what the output is without really going back. I do remember those days of going
Oh
in
yeah.
through like 80% of the information was not relevant to the to what we're looking for, but
Yeah.
it did help to kind of help us create connections of the work and see like what else can I keep searching for.
It's
That
like
was really helpful. Yeah.
I love to use this analogy. I say to people, do you remember before GPS that we had to know where intersections were? We needed to know north, south, east, west. We had to be able to navigate. Imagine your brain when you don't do that anymore. Imagine what your brain's roadmap of knowledge and information looks like when it's just a prompt and an output. You don't question it, you don't understand the contextual information, you have no conceptualization of where it came from. That is the same as saying, well, I go from point A to point B, I go from my house to my school, I go from my house to my job, and I don't know where anything else is. I don't know what's going on around me. I don't know if a traffic light is out or what's going on around me. That's what you're doing to your brain when you outsource that problem solving, that critical thinking, that just conceptualization of the world in which you exist, and you just rely on what ChatGPT is telling you, or Instagram or TikTok
Oh
or
yeah.
even LinkedIn, right? And so I do observe that AI is training people as opposed to
Yeah.
people training AI. And
That is. Yeah.
that's the directionality we really need to reverse.
That's great. I like that in terms of then how can we better train AI? Because you mentioned that example of original thoughts in an email and feeding that to whichever tool that we are using for generative AI so then it can produce the automated results that we want. What
Mhm.
other advice do you have for helping us train AI or use it more effectively?
Mhm. One of the immediate pieces of advice that I give people when they are using large language models, number one, understand what a large language model is. You're using a tool, you need to understand how it is built. You need to understand just the architecture, how models are built. You don't have to be a coder. I'm not saying you have to code. I'm not saying that you have to go out and figure out how to train your own large language model, but you should fundamentally understand how it works. Just like we're using a phone. Do we understand how sound travels across sound waves? That is something that I challenge people. So number one, you need to understand what it does, how it functions, and how you can formulate prompts to get the specific information that you want back. Because there was, if you remember, I think it was about 3-4 months ago, people started noticing that they would be using these tools, specifically ChatGPT, and it was agreeing with them. It was agreeing with everything they said, to the point of the nonsensical, to the point of AI hallucinations. And so, if you understand the way that it works and you understand why that's happening, you would know that OpenAI activated a version of the model that was designed to be more human. And one of the key indicators of humanness is amicability or agreeability. That means
Mm.
you're more likely. And so why did that happen? Well, they wanted it to seem more human. And so at that point, if you typed a prompt into your version of ChatGPT, you could type in a prompt and you could actually say this: only respond with fact-based information from third-party resources. Do not attempt to flatter me in your response.
Oh.
If you type that in, you'll see it thinking, you'll see it processing, and then a new version of the model gets activated. And so when I talk to people about understanding the architecture, understand that there are different kind of versions of the tool that you can use. And you have to, as a human being, to be able to detect that it's telling you nonsense. You know, people were saying that they started using, and I know we talked about this at the conference, they were using artificial intelligence for therapy.
Yeah.
And so my takeaway as a neuroscientist is the positive of that is therapy can be cost prohibitive for a lot of people, right? So the one of the best tools to use for therapy is actually from Anthropic, which is Claude AI. It's not that great to use, you know, if you're having challenges or problems. There are a lot of tools that are not going to give you the best kind of feedback. The reason for that is because Claude uses what's called graduate level reasoning. So it operates on the level of a master's degree or PhD student. Most people don't know that. But if you're typing in all of your problems and you're not giving it context or historical information, it is never going to be able to respond to you in the way that a therapist would. It's never going to understand context. And one of the interesting things I challenge people to do, I say, when you ask a question to a generative AI tool, you'll notice it doesn't know what day it is. Unless you tell it what day it is. And this is even with the paid version. So if I go into the paid version of ChatGPT and I say, I have a project that is due on October 11th, it doesn't know that October 11th is a Saturday. It has no temporality. And so when we think about how we use it, we have to understand you have to give it context. You have to give it information. The more information and specificity that you feed it, the better the response that you're going to get. The more that you train it to understand the use cases. And it's really about the use cases. Am I using this to respond to emails? Am I using this to draft a project plan? Am I using this for research? Am I using this to help me figure out what I need for groceries for the next week or recipes? Context is very, very important. Being specific in what you ask it is very, very important. And that's why I encourage people to have kind of, you know, different projects and keep their conversations separate. So I'll use OpenAI as the best example because most people are familiar with OpenAI. On the side, you should have different folders. And each folder can be for a different use case. And what you'll notice is if each folder is for a different use case, it is immeasurably better at giving you contextually relevant information.
Okay. So having like your own expert on each area that you have trained, that they're prepared to have that to deliver you what you need because you have trained them, or they have the specifics, all the context. Just like when we have the human assistants, yes, so you have the people that will fit that expertise to help you do the work. No, that's fascinating.
This is another little tidbit. So I'm a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian for almost 25 years, but I'm the only vegetarian in my family. So I have different folders for different things. One of the folders is recipes. And in that folder of recipes, I can ask it to respond to me as a chef. So I can say, I want you to respond as Gordon Ramsay. In the voice of Gordon Ramsay, I want you to critique what I'm suggesting for the family meal, or Anthony Bourdain, or whoever you want. So you can ask the tool to respond as you, if you're drafting emails. You can ask it to respond as other people if you're looking for, you know, a recipe. You can actually say to it, and this is really good for people as they're thinking about their career and they want career advice. If you want career advice, you can type in a prompt and say, you know, what's a good example? I am an accounts executive, but I want to become a vice president in 4 years. Here's my resume. You should upload your CV. Tell it the company that you work at. Of course, don't put any, you know, your address, your personal information. Don't put that in there. But you can tell it, I live in this city. This is how old I am. Here's my CV. Here's the company that I work at. Here's where I want to be. And you can actually go on LinkedIn and you can select somebody that you admire who has the career level that you want. And you can say, give me advice to become like this person, to have that
Oh,
job of that person. Like
wonderful.
that's kind of like a cheat code of having a free career coach telling
Yeah.
you, here's somebody I admire, here's where I am, tell me how to get there. That's the job I want in X amount of years.
That is another great advice, particularly career coaching. And as we're planning a next move, so LinkedIn being the place for that. So
Yeah.
that's great. And let's talk through now on specific examples as you've talked in the book, because the book is focused on the aspect of how to developing our brain and understanding our brain, and a lot of this has to do with being away from technology, or what are some steps that you would suggest for developing our brains in terms of, for example, too much time on scrolling is one thing. I want to understand what does that do to our brains, and there's
Mhm.
other key advice that you have there that helps us to truly train our brain effectively.
Mhm. And you know, people often say to me, it's so strange because you build technology, you build AI, you've done it, you know, at all these kind of lovely Fortune 100 companies. You've been in the big four, Sarah. Are you against AI or are you for AI?
Yeah.
And here's you know the very quick sentence I say to them. Technology is not the problem. Any kind of technology, not your TV, not your phone, not AI, not your laptop, not Instagram. That's not the problem. People are the problem. And so, as with anything, it is an addiction. You know, we were not built to consume information within 6 seconds. Even this conversation we're having. If I go on Instagram, there's a reason that the algorithm keeps changing, and there's a reason that the algorithm is increasingly pushing people to have a 6 second or a 7 second, you know, reel. It is a significant amount of dopamine and adrenaline, and dopamine is all about reward, adrenaline is all about this excitement. That dopamine and adrenaline kind of cocktail that goes through your brain is immeasurably addictive. And it's why we're really struggling to even engage in a long form dialogue with each other as human beings. So, as an adult, I have a screen limit for my child. I have a screen limit for me. I set a screen limit on my phone. I do not put my phone on my night table because I know that my brain is being programmed to want to get that dopamine response. It feels you know, you're constantly entertained, you're constantly getting that stimulus, right? You're never bored. And so I say to people, if you find that you're addicted to your devices, have a designated place in your home where you charge your devices, where when
Yeah.
you wake up in the middle of the night, you cannot get your phone. And they say, well, what if there's an emergency? If there's an emergency, you know, put a screen focus on, put a screen limit on. I have started recommending to people, have a landline. I haven't had a landline for years, but you know, have alternate ways for people to get a hold of you if you're so anxious. And so this anxiety and this attention economy that we have, set limits for your exposure to technology. Another really great piece of advice that I give is, you know, I talk about actively listening to silence. And so
Hmm.
sometimes people say, oh, that's kind of like meditation, right? It's the same thing. And I say, no. If you look at the research, there was a phenomenal piece of research from Duke University where they looked at what happens to people when they listen to the sound of silence. Not birds, not a white noise machine, not, you know, kind of wind chimes. No, total silence. And the reason it's total silence is because you're removing all of the stimulus from your environment. Visual, auditory, smell, holding something in your hands, fiddling, that's your sense of touch. Remove all of that stimulus and sit in silence for 5 to 15 minutes a day.
Wow.
This is really cool because it causes brain cells to grow in your memory center. So your memory center is like right in the middle here. It's called your hippocampus. That is what helps you access long-term, short-term memory, to plan for the future, to regulate your nervous system. Listening. When is the last time anybody listened to the sound of silence?
Oof. I feel guilty.
Really, really difficult, but it deregulates your nervous system. It actually rids your brain of what's called neurotoxins, because your brain holds on to these neurotoxins, and it makes it very difficult for you to learn, for you to pay attention, for you to even respond calmly to what's going on in your environment. You know, another really great hack I had earlier this week, I was on the BBC and they said, you know, what's something really easy, like really, really easy that I could start today? And I said to them, start handwriting. And they said, what do you mean? I said, when is the last time that you took even 5 minutes and you wrote down your thoughts in cursive, specifically cursive?
Ooh, cursive. Okay.
And a lot of schools don't even teach cursive anymore. And I said, here's why specifically you should do cursive writing. And it has to be like an actual pen, an actual piece of paper. Don't use your Remarkable. Don't use your tablet. Use a physical piece of paper. The reason for that is you activate your motor cortex. Handwriting is so fine-tuned and unique. It's a unique activity. When you're typing, it's repetitive. Your hands are moving up and down. It's not unique. And so when you write something down, it sends a trigger to your vision center, to your memory center, to your motor cortex, that you need to remember what you wrote down. And, you know, a lot of it sounds kind of a bit old school, but it really is about continuing to train our brain to be active across your cortex. You don't want to centralize the way that it's active in just, it's just activating my vision center. It's just activating my motor cortex. There's one more I'll give you. It's called high intensity interval training. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Yes.
It's like a HIIT. It's called HIIT workouts.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're very intense, really, really challenging. And so I say to people, I challenge you, do a HIIT workout and try to go through this idea of problem solving when you're in your HIIT workout. Why do you do this? You do this because you're artificially putting your body and your brain into a high stress environment that you're completely in control of. And what you do when you're in control of that high stress environment is you train your brain to react with calm and logic to a high stress situation. So when a real high stress situation happens, you're already prepared for you to access not your limbic system, not your fight or flight response, your logic, rational thought. And the same thing happens with AI, right? The more people talk to me, they say, Sarah, I'm terrified. I don't want to use it. I don't want my kids to use it. I'm terrified what's going to happen to my job. And I say to them, that is the worst response. The worst response is to refuse to use something that is not going anywhere. And we really need to hijack that fight or flight response. And that's that kind of version 2.0 of the brain, right? Imagine if every time something chaotic or frightening happened, you could act with logic. That would be, I think, a superpower.
That is amazing, because the aspect of that workout and trying to train our brain to let's say I'm gonna take next time, I usually go on automatic to the workout of the hit workout,
Mhm.
and I just listen to something. But now I'm focusing on that
Mhm.
problem solving. I think that's great advice, and the very basic advice that you provide there, it's incredible how it can really impact
Mhm.
our brain and eh, improve our performance basically.
Mhm.
I want to touch upon a couple of the things uh, that are two skills that we've addressed on this podcast a lot, which are the conflict and empathy. When it comes to conflict, that you have suggested that it is good to have conflict and how it impacts our brain. Could you talk about that?
So, conflict is one of those things, it's an inherently, it's perceived negatively.
Yeah.
People talk about this all the time, and they say, when I'm getting into a discussion with somebody where I don't share the same perspective, it makes me anxious. I feel nervous. Here's my challenge to people: once a month, go and have a coffee date with somebody who has a completely different perspective than you.
Oh, fun.
Not the same. Maybe they're not the same age as you. Maybe they have different political perspectives than you. Maybe they have a different job than you. But really, because we have this tendency to seek out people, this is why I explained what happened, in ChatGPT. Why is it agreeing with you? Because we like to be around people that agree with us. Challenge yourself in, let's call it, a low stakes environment, to have conflict in a low stakes environment. Train your brain to react to that completely different perspective that maybe makes no sense to you. And I do encourage people to seek this out. Seek out people who are not part of your tribe, because we're a very, the human brain is very focused on tribalism and being around people who agree with us, who we're like, yes, I agree. That's exactly how I feel. Oh my gosh, you feel the same way. That gives us dopamine. That's such a positive feeling, right? When somebody says, oh my gosh, I feel exactly the same way. When you push yourself to go outside of your tribe, you are activating a evolved version of your brain, a version of your brain that doesn't see somebody who doesn't look like you, doesn't sound like you, doesn't think like you. You're not perceiving them as a threat. And if you can do this in a kind of a low stakes environment, you will notice in your work and in these high stress environments that you're not reacting to conflict in this inherently defensive way. And
Yeah.
so I've said to people, I challenge you. I do this once a month. I go and I have coffee with somebody that I know I'm not going to have a lot in common with. I push
Yeah.
myself to be uncomfortable and do that.
That's great. And understanding, particularly in today's environment where our feeds, our relationships are all with people that agree with us,
Yeah.
and we set ourselves to have a lot of not being willing to embrace those disagreements. Now, how about for empathy? Because you mentioned something important there about the making a deliberate effort to be empathetic with others. How does that impact our brains?
When we think about empathy, I like to talk about gratitude, and specifically something called mirror neurons. And so when we verbally express gratitude to other people, it doesn't really matter what it's for. That actually triggers an empathetic response. And I think there's an important distinction between empathy and sympathy, right? Empathy is saying, I relate to how the person feels. Sympathy is saying, I feel sorry for the person, but
Hmm.
I can't relate to what they're going through. I can't relate to what's happening to them. And so I think it's really important in a work environment to distinguish between empathy and sympathy. And so, normally when people talk about empathy, And let's say somebody comes to you and they tell you, I just got laid off from my job, Yadi. And this is happening a lot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The first most human inclination is to say, I know exactly how you feel.
Yeah.
That's the worst thing that you can say, because that's not really empathetic. And so the challenge I put to human beings when they're in a work environment, or doesn't matter, platonic, romantic, when somebody comes to you and they tell you, this terrible thing happened to me, or I'm feeling, I'm going through this experience, I'm not feeling safe, maybe something's happening in my neighborhood. The first thing you should say, don't reflect back onto yourself. Yeah. Because that's what's happening in the brain, right? The brain is saying, okay, I got a piece of information. I need to label it. I need to relate it to something that happened to me, because that's how I understand the world. That's how I perceive the world. I have all these little folders, and I'm going to go into one of my little folders and I'm going to say, I know exactly how that makes you feel. Here's how I dealt with it. Here's this really terrible thing that happened to me. And then you make it all about you. Yeah. That's not empathy. And so the best thing to do when somebody comes to you and they tell you, whether it's your employee or your kid or your partner, and they say, here's how I'm feeling, I always say, this is the best response. What can I do to support you in the way that you need in this moment? I don't know how you're feeling. I can imagine how you're feeling, but I don't know how you're feeling. What do you need from me in this moment? That is true empathy. True empathy is giving people what they need in the moment. And when you do that, there's a specific type of brain cell that gets activated. It's called a mirror neuron. A mirror neuron mimics what we see in others. And so the reason that we tend to imitate other people and we mimic other people is because the brain cells are fired when we're imitating each other. They just fire back and forth. That kind of explains why we have to be very careful who we surround ourselves with 90% of the time, because these mirror neurons get activated. And so when you express empathy in a truly meaningful way, and you're showing up for the person in the way that they need you to show up for them, they're going to start doing that for you as well. And so I think, it really does activate your emotion center. It activates the part of your brain that's called your amygdala. That's all of your emotional processing. And really, when you look at the brain, it's a supercomputer, right? Mm-hmm. There are billions and billions and billions of brain cells. It is more powerful than any piece of technology could ever be. The most unfortunate part is that most people don't know a lot about the structures of the brain that are working. And they don't even know that being even aware of a structure activates it. Yeah. So, the way that you can be aware of your heartbeat, you can regulate your heartbeat. Mm-hmm. You can actually regulate parts of your brain in exactly the same way that you regulate your heartbeat. And that was, I think, a big part of the ethos of writing the book for me, that I think everybody deserves access to this knowledge. Yeah. It's this democracy of not everybody has to be a neuroscientist or a surgeon or an AI architect. We deserve access to that information kind of globally.
Yeah. And I certainly enjoyed so much reading your book, The 100 Ways to Future-Proof Your Brain, because it was a lot of key advice in terms of the easy reading, yet also understanding a lot of how our brain works. And thank you so much for this great conversation, because I wish I could keep talking and kind of getting all the understanding and idea. So it's great. And thank you for sharing your knowledge. For people who want to know more about you and your work, what's the best way for them to reach you?
They can go to my website, www.sarahbaldeo.com. I am currently on a book tour across Barnes & Noble in the US, Indigo for the Canadians that are out there. The book is now in 13 different countries, which is super, super exciting, and such a wonderful response that people really are curious. Right? Absolutely. They're curious and they want to know about their brains. They don't want to feel terrified about it, this age of AI. So I'm always happy for people to reach out to me on LinkedIn or Instagram, carrier pigeon, whatever way they want to reach out. I'm always excited to kind of have these dialogues about really upgrading our brain to evolve faster than AI is.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being here with me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Yadi. Take care.